The doors of courtroom 4B swung open, and Hillary Johnson walked out without looking back. She moved the way she always moved when things had gone wrong, deliberately, chin level, folder pressed flat against her chest, like a claim she was still making. Behind her, through the heavy door, she could hear the judge thanking the parties for their time. Thanking them, as if time were the thing that had been spent. As if the 34-year-old woman with 2 daughters standing by the respondents' table had simply come in today to spend a morning. Maria Santos had been in that room. 34 years old, mother of 2 daughters, 6 and 8. 11 years in an apartment on Gilmore Street that she had painted, repaired, and kept in better condition than the management company ever had. The eviction notice had arrived 8 weeks ago, procedurally clean, technically correct, backed by a rent ledger her attorney had submitted through the same authentication process Hillary had used successfully in 6 prior cases. And then, at 10:47 that morning, Marcus Webb, the witness who had agreed, in writing, twice, had texted through his sister that he couldn't come in. No explanation, no contact after. The defense had moved immediately on the authentication challenge. The judge had no clean basis to deny it. Maria Santos would receive a formal eviction order within 30 days. Hillary passed the clerk's desk, the water fountain with the empty cup dispenser, the bulletin board no one updated. She pushed through the glass door at the end of the hallway and walked out into the afternoon. The courthouse steps were broad and gray and warm from a sun that didn't care about what had happened inside. She stopped at the 3rd step from the top and sat down, placed the folder on her knees, looked at the street without focusing on any particular point. 6 months. Webb contacted twice in writing, confirmed twice. The authentication process identical to the Mendez case, the Reyes case, the Okafor case, none of which had been challenged. The arguments solid. And someone, in the 12 hours before this hearing, had made a phone call that undid all of it. She wasn't going to cry on courthouse steps. She had made herself that promise long before she needed it. But there was a specific tension in her eyes, a fine, controlled compression, that anyone who knew her well would have recognized immediately. It was at this point that she heard footsteps stop 2 steps below. She didn't turn around. She recognized the quiet of it, the particular, considered way Peter Kim occupied space. He had been in the building for a separate matter, left early, seen her face in the hallway with enough time to understand what it meant. He didn't ask what happened. He didn't offer a framework. He sat 1 step below, looked at the same street she was looking at, and after a silence that lasted exactly as long as it needed to, said, almost without inflection, almost to the city, "You started this for people who had no one. Today it hurt, because you are still that person." Hillary looked at him, just for a second, then back at the street. She didn't respond, but something in her shoulders, some precise degree of accumulated weight, shifted. Not because he had solved anything, because he had named the real thing without requiring her to explain it first, and then had not asked her to put it down. This is where the story begins. If you've ever kept going when every reason to stop was right in front of you, this story is for you. Subscribe and stay close, because we're just getting started, and what comes next changes everything. Hillary had been a legal aid lawyer for 9 years, which meant she had been underpaid, consistently overextended, and absolutely certain she was in the right place for the entirety of her adult life. She had grown up in Baltimore's Park Heights neighborhood, in a row house on a block where the difference between stability and crisis was often one missed paycheck. Her mother, Diane, had worked double shifts at a hospital cafeteria and kept a small notebook where she recorded every bill, every due date, every grace period. Because in their house, grace periods were not kindness. They were just debt with a polite name and a short calendar. Hillary had watched her mother refuse help from a neighbor who offered to contact a housing organization when an eviction notice came. She had watched her stack papers and say, "We'll handle it ourselves." Watched her carry it alone for weeks until a cousin arrived with cash that came attached to years of quiet debt. That refusal, its pride and its cost, had lodged in Hillary at 17 and never fully left. It was not something she had processed out loud. It had simply become architecture. She had gone into housing law because of that notebook. Because of the precise, careful handwriting of a woman managing an impossible situation with no support, no information, and too much dignity to ask for either. She had taken the bar exam on a Thursday and started at the advocacy center on a Monday, and had never once questioned whether she was in the wrong place. At 31, her caseload at the Baltimore Civil Rights and Housing Advocacy Center ran between 22 and 28 active files at any given time. She shared an office with Camille Rhodes, 29, sharp, constitutionally incapable of offering reassurance she didn't mean, who was the closest thing Hillary had to a person she could think out loud in front of. Not because Camille was gentle about what she heard, because she wasn't. Her boss, Renata Voss, ran the operation with the efficiency of someone who had learned to fight from inside a structure and considered it a form of discipline, not surrender. She had been doing this work for longer than Hillary had been a lawyer, which meant she had also been disappointed by it for longer, which was visible in the particular economy of her encouragement. Peter Kim worked on the floor above, technically under a different organization, the Public Defender's Office, where he served as a document forensic investigator and civil case consultant. They had been crossing paths in courthouse hallways for 4 years. The dynamic had always been professional and direct. Mutual respect, the occasional shared observation, a running familiarity with the same terrible vending machine coffee on the 3rd floor that neither of them had ever stopped buying, despite unanimous agreement that they should. The afternoon on the courthouse steps had not changed the category of what they were, but it had made something visible that both of them had been seeing for a while without naming. Hillary was back at her desk by 5:15, folder open, laptop running before she had taken off her coat. Camille looked up from across the room. How bad? The witness didn't show. Camille set down her pen. Marcus Webb? His sister sent a text at 10:47. No explanation, no contact after. That's not a personal decision. No, it isn't. Hillary pulled up the hearing notes. The ground the defense used was the authentication of the rent ledger copies. I used the exact same process in the Mendez case last year. No challenge. Camille was quiet for a moment. Someone told them where to look. That's what I keep coming back to. Hillary scrolled. The authentication challenge was technically clean, but it required knowing, in advance, that the ledger would be the weakest link, which it isn't, objectively. It just happened to be the one thing I couldn't immediately correct in the room. You're going to appeal. It was not a question. 21 days, Hillary said. The deadline. Camille nodded once and returned to her work without comment. This was, in Hillary's experience, one of the most useful things Camille was capable of doing. She knew when something had already been decided and didn't waste either of their time on commentary designed to make the decision feel accompanied. Hillary stayed after 7. The office went quiet around her, the particular silence of a building that has emptied but not yet relaxed. The hum of the HVAC, the distant elevator, the small sounds a building makes when it believes it is alone. She was running a precedent search when she found it, a 2019 ruling that cited the exact procedural error the defense had used that morning. Same language, different judge, different district. She opened the case number. The management company listed in the defendant's filing was Hargrove Associates, the same company behind the Santos case. She leaned back and looked at the ceiling for a full minute. Then she picked up her phone and called Peter. He answered on the second ring. I think the Santos case is bigger than one apartment, she said, without preamble. A brief pause, not surprise, but consideration. How much bigger? I don't know yet. I need someone who reads documents the way other people read sentences. Another pause. She heard him set something down on a surface. Send me what you have. I'll look at it tonight. She did. Then she sat at her desk for another hour, reading and rereading what she had found, before the walls of the office started to feel too small for the size of what she was beginning to understand. She went home, not because she had finished, but because she knew the shape of the night better than to push it past the point of clarity. She thought she was building an appeal. She didn't know yet she was building a case. Peter's message arrived at 6:48 the next morning. There are 11 of them. No other text. Then, 1 minute later, when can you talk? They met in the courthouse hallway at 8. Neutral ground, functional, the kind of corridor where two professionals with folders looked entirely unremarkable. Peter had printed a 4-page summary, annotated in margins with the clean, undecorative handwriting she had come to associate with conclusions he'd already tested. 11 eviction cases across Baltimore, past 3 years, he said, voice kept below conversational. Different tenants, different neighborhoods, different lawyers. Every single one failed on a procedural ground: documentation error, missed deadline, authentication issue. Each ground was technically valid. Each one also required knowing, in advance, what the opposing counsel had submitted. Hillary read as he spoke. Hargrove Associates. Present in 8 of the 11. The remaining 3 involved 2 different management companies, both sharing a registered agent with Hargrove. She turned to the second page. Same attorney on their side? Different attorneys, same firm, Whitmore and Reese. She knew the name. Every legal aid lawyer in Baltimore did. A mid-sized civil firm with a quiet reputation for making problems disappear on paper, not corrupt in any traceable sense, just consistently, precisely effective at finding the technical exit. Marcus Webb, she said. Not confirmed yet, but I can trace adjacent civil filings through cross-reference. I'll look for a phone record pattern. He paused. This is going to get complicated before it gets clear. Does that concern you? He considered it genuinely. No. Does it concern you? Not in the way you mean, she said. And they both understood which way she meant. She took the summary back to her office and read it again with her door closed, which was unusual. Normally, she read everything in the open. She had never developed the habit of private deliberation because there had never been anything sensitive enough to warrant it. 11 cases. The same firm. The same invisible thread running through procedural defeats that had been treated by everyone involved as isolated losses. She thought about the lawyers who had worked those other 10 cases. People like her, showing up with inadequate resources and doing the best they could with the documentation in front of them. They had lost and moved on to the next file, the way you do when you have 25 more waiting. None of them had reason to connect what had happened to them to what had happened to someone else in a different neighborhood 2 years earlier. That was, she understood, entirely the point. Camille's reaction that morning was tripartite and efficient. First, this was simultaneously the worst and best development possible. Second, Renata needed to know before she found out from someone else. Third, if Peter Kim had been quietly holding 11 connected cases and led with a 4-page annotated summary, Hillary owed him something better than third-floor vending machine coffee. He drinks the machine coffee too, Hillary said. That's practically a covenant in this building. Camille returned to her keyboard without waiting for a response. Renata's door was open in the way it was when she expected someone to come through it with a complication. Hillary laid out the pattern in 10 minutes. Facts, connections, scope. Renata listened with her hands folded on the desk, the expression of someone building a risk ledger in real time. When Hillary finished, Renata said, "You're planning to appeal the Santos case on these grounds." "Yes, and expand the evidentiary scope." "The appeal is the lever. The pattern is the argument underneath it." A silence. "The organization has funders who work adjacent to the real estate sector. I'm not telling you that as a directive. I'm telling you because you need to understand the weight of what you're pulling." "I understand it. Understanding a weight and being prepared for what carrying it costs are 2 different things." Renata held her gaze. "File the appeal. Keep me on every development. And if this grows to a scale that threatens the operation, I'll come to you first." She left with permission and a warning, and the knowledge that Renata had given her both because she had earned them. What Renata hadn't said, and what Hillary hadn't missed. Careful wasn't a strategy. It was a request. Marcus Webb had left no forwarding address. This was not unusual. People who withdrew under pressure had a way of becoming quietly unavailable, not fleeing, just making themselves inaccessible through a series of small, undramatic steps. A changed number, a relative's address used instead of their own, a brief relocation to a cousin's place 2 neighborhoods over. Hillary had seen the pattern enough times to recognize it without requiring documentary proof. But the shape of this disappearance was precise in a way that kept pulling her back to it. Marcus Webb had been a composed, articulate man when she had met him. He had understood the stakes, and agreed twice, in writing. He had responded to her preparatory calls within a business day. Whatever had changed had been applied from outside, not arrived at from within. Peter confirmed what Camille had intuited. A phone registered to an LLC called Coastal Property Advisors had placed 2 calls to Marcus Webb's personal number in the 12 hours before the Santos hearing. The LLC dissolved 14 days after the case closed. No direct link to Hargrove, no crime in any traceable sense, but not nothing. She filed this and kept moving. Preparing the appeal required documentation she didn't currently have, specifically, internal Hargrove communications regarding the rent ledger authentication process that had formed the basis of the procedural challenge. She filed a discovery request. It came back narrow. Opposing counsel had preemptively applied a confidentiality classification she hadn't anticipated, limiting the discoverable scope to documents already in the public record. She called Peter. They anticipated the discovery request. They anticipated the entire case, he said, which means they've been watching it longer than you realized. She stood at her apartment window, looking at the row of row houses across the street. Brick, close together. The kind of housing that looked permanent from outside, and wasn't, not in this city, not for the families who needed it to be. At the original hearing, she said, there was a Whitmore and Reese attorney I didn't recognize. Not arguing, just observing. He looked at me when I walked in for a second longer than necessary. I remember him from the hallway. I was there for a different case, same floor. He wasn't there by accident. No. A pause. Discovery alerts on your name would have flagged the appeal filing within hours of submission. It doesn't require a mole. It might just be a monitoring system. A system is almost worse than a person. A person can be wrong. Yes, he said. It is. She pulled the blind down. I need all 11 case files, not summaries, originals. If there's an internal logic to how Whitmore and Reese constructed the procedural challenges, I need to see it in their own language. Thursday. The files arrived Thursday afternoon, as stated. She read them over 2 evenings. First pass for facts, second pass for pattern. The pattern was there. Not identical across cases, but familial. The same legal reasoning wearing different clothes. The same underlying confidence that no one would trace the challenges across separate case numbers, because no one had reason to. No one had, until now. The case was starting to look less like negligence and more like a system, and someone had built it carefully enough to believe it was invisible. Hillary spread the 11 files across the conference room table on a Saturday and stayed until she had read every page. This was not required. It was how she worked. From an inability to leave things incomplete that looked like discipline from outside, and felt, from inside, like something she had never learned to switch off. Camille had told her once, without softening it, that this quality was both her greatest asset and the one most likely to eventually cost her. Hillary had agreed and kept working. The agreement was genuine. So was the continuation. Peter arrived at 10 with 2 cups of coffee and took the far end of the table without discussion. He opened his laptop. They worked in the particular silence of 2 people who had learned that occupying the same room doesn't require continuous conversation, the kind of silence that has content, that is itself a form of presence. By mid-morning, she had isolated 3 cases where the procedural challenge had been structurally identical, even though the surface details differed. Different tenants, different neighborhoods, different documentation issues. But the challenge had arrived at the same moment in each proceeding, late enough to be difficult to correct, early enough to be technically within the rules, precise timing, the kind of precision that is practiced. Peter, at the far end, had been tracing something separate. He cross-referenced the defending attorneys against internal court records and went quiet for a long period, which was usually a sign he had found something he was testing before presenting it. Mid-afternoon, without looking up, he said, Case 7, the Reyes family. The procedural error was in the notarization of an income verification document. The same notary whose stamp was challenged also notarized documents in cases 4 and 9. Different Hargrove attorneys each time. Same stamp, different challenge. They cede it, Hillary said. Plant a notarization they know can be contested. Wait for the opposing lawyer to use it, then challenge at the last moment when correction is impossible. Every lawyer who took these cases worked in good faith with what they had. Hillary looked at the spread of files in front of her. 11 families, 11 cases handled by different attorneys in different neighborhoods, none of whom had reason to compare notes. These weren't poorly built cases. They were sabotaged cases. The word occupied the room for a moment. Peter set his pen down. Proving intent is the challenge. The procedural errors are real. They can argue exploitation of genuine weakness, not creation of it. To establish the pattern as evidence of design, we need the chain to be long enough that coincidence stops being a credible explanation. Then we build the chain. He looked at her with the consideration he reserved for things he wasn't sure he should say directly. This is going to attract attention before it reaches a courtroom. I know. Not the favorable kind. I know. She met his gaze steadily. Does that change what we're doing? He picked up his pen. No. One word. No performance in it. No reassurance designed to make her feel managed. Just a fact, stated clearly. She was beginning to understand that Peter operated this way. What he said was what he meant, and what he meant didn't require elaboration. They worked until the building's cleaning crew arrived at 7. Walking out, he held the elevator without making a statement of it. In the lobby, she said, You didn't have to come in today. I know, he said. Same tone. She walked to her car. He walked to his. Nothing announced. But something had settled, the way things settle when they return to where they were always supposed to be. 11 families, 11 cases, one pattern, and now 2 people who could see it, which meant, for the first time, they were a threat. The disciplinary complaint arrived on a Tuesday morning. Hillary read it standing in the courthouse lobby, waiting for an unrelated hearing. The subject line was formal and measured, designed to sound procedural, so the wait takes a moment to register. An anonymous filing with the Maryland Attorney Grievance Commission, citing alleged misconduct in her handling of the Santos case. Specifically, improper contact with a potential witness prior to testimony. She read it twice, put her phone in her coat pocket, walked into the hearing, argued it with full attention, won a continuance. Back at the office, she opened the complaint on her screen and read it the way she read opposing counsel's briefs, looking for the architecture behind the language. The alleged contact with Marcus Webb was described with a specificity that required either direct surveillance or access to her case materials that an anonymous third party wouldn't possess. 2 of the 3 dates cited were accurate. The characterization of her contact with Webb was distorted. She had spoken with him twice, professionally, with documentation, but the distortion was subtle enough to demand investigation to disprove. This was not a harassment tactic. This was a precise instrument. Camille read it over her shoulder without invitation. 30 seconds of silence. Then, they know you're building something. They're trying to force me to defend myself instead of advancing the case, Hillary said. Standard delay. If I'm managing a disciplinary response, I'm not building the appeal brief. Tell Renata today. I know. Today, Hillary. Not end of day. Now. She told Renata within the hour. Renata read the complaint, asked 3 precise questions, then sat back with the expression of someone adjusting the parameters of a risk they had already been tracking. This is what I meant when I said to be careful. This was always coming, Hillary said. The only difference careful would have made is the timing. Renata looked at her for a long moment. I can't intervene in an attorney grievance matter. I'm not asking you to. I know. I'm telling you because you're on your own, officially, on this one, and unofficially. She stopped. Your documentation is clean. Don't let them make you defensive when you have nothing to defend. That night, at 11, Hillary called Peter from the floor of her apartment, back against the couch, case files spread around her. The position was practical. She needed to see everything at once. She had also, she realized, stopped performing uprightness for the night. They filed a disciplinary complaint, she said when he answered. When did you get it? This morning. She outlined the claims. He listened without interrupting. The date specificity, he said. That's the key detail. It requires access to your scheduling or direct surveillance, or a careful reconstruction from public filings and observable movements. It doesn't matter how they built it. I need to dismantle it. You will. A pause. You should sleep. I can't. Your thinking won't hold if you don't. She looked at the files around her. How do you stay level when everything is this much at once? Another pause, long enough to be genuine. I don't always, he said. I wait until it passes and keep going. That's endurance, not a strategy. Sometimes they're the same thing. She didn't have a response to that. But she found, when she moved the files aside and sat on the couch instead, that the silence between them had a quality she hadn't registered having in a while. She said goodnight. He said goodnight. She slept 4 hours and woke up clear. The complaint was meant to make her small. Instead, it told her exactly how seriously they were taking what she had built. The Bruno. Her response to the disciplinary complaint was filed Thursday, 1 day ahead of schedule, 42 pages of exhibits, every claim addressed with contemporaneous documentation. The preliminary reviewer told her, without elaboration, that it was the most organized response at this stage he had seen in 3 years. She thanked him and left before she let herself feel anything about it. What she didn't say to anyone. The night she had spent building that response had been the most frightened she had been in years. Not of losing her license. The record was clean and she knew it. The fear was less articulable than that. Someone had decided she was worth targeting specifically by name. The work she had been carrying as duty had become a target on her back. She had felt it, not converted it immediately into productivity, but actually felt it, and she wasn't entirely sure what to do with that distinction. Camille arrived Friday with 2 coffees and said, "The complaint is going to be dismissed." I know. I also know you know. I'm saying it because knowing and feeling it are different, and you're allowed to let them be different for a minute. Hillary accepted the coffee. You've been spending time with Peter. I've been spending time with you and paying attention. Camille sat. He's very... Camille. Present. I was going to say present. As a descriptive term, a professional observation. The appeal hearing was set for the following Wednesday. Peter had completed the evidentiary map, a document tracing the procedural pattern across all 11 cases with forensic precision, the kind of document that didn't argue, it simply showed. He sent it Monday evening with 1 line. Ready when you are. She read the document carefully, then the line, then the document again, with the line in mind. Ready when you are was not a filler phrase from Peter. It was an offering made at exactly the right distance, neither crowding her nor withdrawing. She wrote back, "See you at 7, thank you." Deleted the thank you, retyped it, left it in. The appeal hearing was different in texture from the Santos hearing. Not in outcome, not yet, but in the quality of attention in the room. The judge asked sharper questions. 3 attorneys from Whitmore and Reese appeared for the defense, 2 more than the Santos case had required. Peter and David Ossie sat in the gallery, formally listed as civil case consultants who had filed supporting evidentiary briefs. The judge requested supplemental documentation on 2 specific points and gave Hillary 14 days. In the hallway after, Gerald Cross, senior Whitmore and Reese partner, mid-50s, the kind of polish that comes from decades of winning on paper, appeared at her left elbow while she was reviewing her notes. Ms. Johnson. The tone was pleasant and entirely without warmth. You're doing interesting work. She looked up. Thank you. Complicated territory, he said, the kind that tends to expand until it consumes more than the original question. He adjusted one cuff. The original question, as I understood it, was one family in one apartment. The original question, she said, without heat, is whether a company systematically sabotaged legal proceedings to displace tenants illegally. One family is where it started. 12 are where it is. He smiled the way people smile when they've already calculated the outcome. Have a good day. She watched him leave. Peter appeared at her shoulder at the precise right moment. How long? 40 seconds. He was counting on less, Peter said. Gerald Cross had made the particular mistake that careful people sometimes make. He had underestimated how much a woman at her limit is capable of hearing. 3 days after the hearing, David Ossie found something that changed the shape of the case. A property management conference in Annapolis, 8 months prior, had featured a panel titled Litigation Risk Reduction in Residential Real Estate. The session notes, retrieved through a public records request David had filed on a separate matter, included a section on documentation authentication challenges. The language was almost verbatim a technical roadmap for the procedural strategy deployed across Hillary's 11 cases. The panel had been presented by a consultant from a firm linked to Hargrove Associates. They published it, Camille said, reading at Hillary's desk. They put the strategy in a conference presentation. Because they didn't believe anyone would connect a conference session to a courtroom filing, Hillary said, or they were confident that even if someone did, it wouldn't matter. Peter cross-referenced the presentation language with the 11 case files and produced a comparative analysis showing the procedural logic had been adapted, not copied, but clearly derived, in 7 of the 11 filings. The evidentiary chain, which had been strong but arguable, became difficult to dismiss as coincidence. Hillary brought this to Renata on Thursday. Renata read the analysis, set it down, looked at Hillary with the expression of someone who had been hoping a situation would stop developing, and was now watching it develop further. One of our principal funders, Renata said, has a capital partnership with a real estate group that shares board members with Hargrove Associates. I looked it up after the appeal hearing. The room was quiet. Are you asking me to stop? Renata was still for a moment. I'm telling you what I know. What you do with it is your decision. She looked at the analysis. Officially, I need this to be airtight before anything goes public. Unofficially. A pause. You're doing the right thing. That doesn't mean I can guarantee the organization comes through the aftermath intact. Hillary left the meeting with the 2 things she had most needed to hear, and the weight of having both of them at once. She did not cry. She drove to a parking lot 2 blocks from the office, put the car in park, and sat with her hands on the steering wheel. The afternoon was gray in the flat, uninflected way of Baltimore in the fall. No drama in it, just a light that made everything look like exactly what it was. She stared through the windshield at a chain-link fence at the far end of the lot and let herself feel the full size of what she was carrying. Not the case. The case was fine. The case was, in fact, the strongest it had ever been. She was carrying the fact that she had gotten here by not stopping when every reasonable version of the situation had given her permission to, and that continuing was going to cost something she couldn't fully calculate yet, and that the people closest to her were paying into that cost without being asked. She thought about Maria Santos, about 11 families, none of whom had known about the others, about her mother's notebook, about what it meant to do the right thing inside a structure that had its own logic of survival. Her phone showed a message from Peter. David mentioned you went to your car. Are you okay? She looked at it for a long moment. Then, I will be. Give me a few minutes. No reply came. 8 minutes later, he appeared in the parking lot. He leaned against his car 1 row over, coffee in hand, and did not approach. He was simply there, in the same concrete, non-dramatic way he had always been there. Not performing presence, just present. When she got out of her car, He handed her the coffee without commentary. She drank it. They stood in the parking lot for 10 minutes without talking. The chain-link fence was still there. The gray light was still flat. The city was still the city. And somewhere in the particular quality of that silence, two people standing in a parking lot in the middle of a workday because one of them needed the other to be there. Something shifted that she couldn't have named precisely, but registered completely. Then she said, "I'm not stopping." "I know," he said. "Renata might need to distance the organization formally." "I know. This could get worse before it resolves." "Yes." He looked at her directly. "Are you telling me this as a status update or as a warning?" She looked at him. "I don't know yet." He accepted that, nodded once. "Either way, I'm still on the case." She didn't say thank you, but she looked at him long enough that he knew it had landed. She had been alone in that parking lot until she wasn't, and she was beginning to understand that the difference between those two states was larger than she had ever let herself believe. On Sunday, Hillary drove to Park Heights. Not strategically. The kind of decision that happens when the thinking becomes too loud, and the only solution is proximity to something older and more anchored than the present moment. Her mother's row house on a street she had known for 30 years. She could navigate it in the dark, had done it once as a child on a bet, still considered it one of the things she knew absolutely. Diane Johnson was in the kitchen. 60 years in Baltimore had given her a specific quality: pragmatic, warm, not easily impressed, not easily frightened. She took one look at her daughter and said, "Sit down." Hillary sat at the kitchen table and watched her mother make tea without being asked. The kitchen smelled like it always had. Cinnamon, the clicking radiator, the geranium Diane kept on the sill because she believed plants in the house kept the air honest. "Tell me," Diane said. Hillary told her. Not the procedural details. The shape of it. The pattern she had found. The pressure. The complaint. Renata's warning. The parking lot. The fact that she was scared in a way she had not said out loud until this moment. Diane listened the way she listened to everything. Entirely. Without the reassurance-shaped interruptions that were actually impatience with discomfort. When Hillary finished, her mother was quiet for a moment, both hands around her cup. "I have something to tell you," Diane said. "I should have told you a long time ago." The shift in her voice was recognizable. Hillary waited. "When we almost lost this house, you were 17. I remember. What you don't know is that 3 weeks before your cousin came with the money, a woman from a housing organization came to the door. She had seen the notice. She offered to help." Diane looked at her tea. "I told her we didn't need it." Hillary looked at her mother. "I closed the door." Pride. I had worked too hard to be the woman who couldn't manage her own situation, and I couldn't stand the idea of being a case. She said the word with a complicated expression. "So I said no. I didn't tell anyone, including you. And for 3 weeks I tried to figure it out alone, and I almost didn't." Hillary's hands were still around her cup. She looked at her mother, at the woman who had written every bill in a small notebook, who had taught her, without ever saying it in those words, that needing help was something that happened to other people. "You carried that," Hillary said. "For years." Diane met her eyes. "I'm telling you now because you're sitting at my kitchen table scared, and you look exactly the way I looked in this kitchen for those 3 weeks, and I don't want you to do what I did." Hillary was quiet for a long time. She looked at her mother's hands. The hands that had written every bill in that small notebook, that had worked double shifts and called it ordinary, that had closed a door on offered help and never told anyone. Not because she was ashamed of needing help, but because asking had felt like an admission she couldn't afford. Those hands were older now, the knuckles a little more prominent. The ring from Hillary's grandmother on the right index finger, the same placement where Hillary wore her own. The silence between them was the kind that changes things. "I became a lawyer," Hillary said slowly, "because I thought if I could give people what you didn't have." "I know," Diane said. I never thought about whether I was doing the same thing you did. I know that too. Her mother looked at her steadily. You're not me, but you learned from me. And I want you to learn the other part now, while there's still time to use it. Hillary drove back to Baltimore that evening with the windows down, and the thing that had been locked somewhere in her chest since the parking lot had started, quietly, to move. She called Peter when she got home. I need to tell you something, she said when he answered. Not about the case. A pause. Okay. I've been managing all of this the way I manage everything, which means keeping it at a distance where no one can see all of it at once. And I think I inherited that, and I'm only just now understanding what it cost. A silence. The good kind. I'm not going to stop fighting the case, she said. But I don't want to do it alone anymore. Not the professional version of alone. You've been there for that. I mean the other kind. I know which kind, he said. I know you know. Is this you asking? She exhaled. Yes. Good, he said. Simply, without decoration. I've been measured about this. And measured was the wrong word for what I actually meant. When did you figure that out? Parking lot, he said, when you got out of your car and didn't ask me to leave. Some things don't need to be announced. They just need to be said once, clearly, to the right person. Dadri. The supplemental documentation was filed on day 14 at 9:17 a.m. Hillary had built it over 2 weeks, with Camille's structural review, David's field research, Peter's forensic analysis. But the argument was hers, written in the language she had developed over 9 years of representing people who had no one else in the room. She filed it and sat at her desk without touching anything for a full minute. Just sat with it. The particular stillness of a thing completed. Camille appeared with coffee. It's the best thing you've written. You haven't read all of it. I read enough. She sat. Peter's coming in this afternoon. He has something to show me. Camille's expression was the one she wore when she was refraining from a comment she considered self-evident. Good. Very professional. Camille, I'm just noting that the man drove to a parking lot on a workday and stood there in solidarity. In this economy, that is simply a fact I am recording. Despite everything, Hillary smiled. It was small and real, and she registered both qualities. Peter arrived at 3 with a folder she hadn't seen before. Thin, 30 pages, but dense. He set it on her desk and sat across from her and let her open it without preface. The first page was dated 9 weeks earlier. It was a forensic summary in his format, but the central inconsistency it documented was one she hadn't found until much later in her own work. The notary connection, the conference presentation link, the chain between the 11 cases. All of it, assembled with the same careful logic, 9 weeks before she had reached the same conclusions independently. She looked up from the page. You found this before the appeal. Yes. Before the disciplinary complaint. Yes. How long before I called you about the Santos case? 3 weeks. He kept his voice even. I was working a separate matter that touched the same property group. I found the thread and followed it. She was quiet. The office was quiet around them. Somewhere down the hallway, a phone rang once and stopped. Why didn't you bring it to me? He looked at her directly. Because you had just lost a case you had worked 6 months to build. And I knew that if I walked in with the answer the day after, you would have taken the information and run with it, and you would have built an appeal and potentially won it without understanding why the pattern existed, which is what makes the argument unbreakable in court. He paused. And I knew that if it came too early, you wouldn't fully trust it. Not because you're distrustful. Because you don't trust things you didn't help build. You needed to find it yourself. You knew that about me. I've been watching you work for 4 years, he said, simply. She held the folder. You waited so I could get here. I waited because you needed to get here yourself, he said. I just needed to make sure you wouldn't fall on the way. The phrase settled with full weight. She had been holding things together for 9 years, cases, arguments, herself. And he had been, quietly, one step below. Not because he couldn't stand beside her. Because he had understood before she did that the step below was where she needed someone most. She set the folder on the desk between them. "I would have trusted it," she said, after a moment, "if it had come from you." "I know," he said. "Now." A pause. She looked at the folder, then at him. "This is everything. It's everything I have. The rest is yours." He had kept it not from strategy, but from care. And that turned out to be a kind of evidence she hadn't known she was waiting for. Nadir. The hearing was on a Thursday, 11 days after the supplemental brief was filed. Hillary arrived early, a habit she had, without consciously deciding to, adopted from observing Peter. She stood in the hallway and looked at the courtroom door and breathed through the silence before the building demanded something from it. She had the Santos case. She had the 11 connected cases, the forensic pattern, the conference roadmap, the notary chain, the LLC that had called Marcus Webb and dissolved shortly after. She had 37 pages of supplemental brief and a closing argument she had written and rewritten until it stopped being a legal document and became something closer to a testimony. The kind of document that carries, underneath the citations, the reason why the person writing it got into this work in the first place. Camille had read the final draft, been silent for 2 full minutes, then said, "It's ready." David had texted Peter that morning. "She's going to do something real today." Peter had shown her the message. She had not replied, but read it 3 times. The courtroom filled steadily. Gerald Cross arrived with 2 associates, the practiced stride of someone who had won this particular kind of argument before. He saw Hillary and offered the same measured nod as before. She held his gaze an extra second, which he registered and filed without showing. Judge Patricia Morrow had presided over Baltimore civil cases for 19 years. She had the reputation of someone who had read everything before the session began and asked questions to confirm conclusions she had already formed. When she walked in, the room adjusted the way rooms do around people who don't need to announce their authority. The hearing ran 4 hours. It went differently than the Santos hearing. Not in outcome, not yet, but in the quality of the room's attention. The judge leaned forward during the evidentiary portion. She asked Hillary to walk through the conference presentation link slowly, piece by piece, which Hillary did. She asked Cross whether he had any prior knowledge of the panel in question. He said he did not. She made a note. Hillary argued without notes for the last 40 minutes. She did not use the phrase systematic negligence. She let the chain of evidence make that argument for her, which was something Peter had modeled through watching him work. Let the document speak, then say only what the document cannot. She walked Judge Morrow through the 11 cases not as a list, but as a demonstration of method. How the same strategy had been adapted and redeployed against families who had no means of connecting the cases, because no one had ever given them reason to try. She talked about Maria Santos last, not as a symbol, as a person. A woman who had painted her own apartment walls, who had filed every maintenance request in writing, who had done everything correctly, and still found herself on the losing side of a proceeding that was designed to go that way. She said this in 3 sentences and let the 3 sentences carry what they needed to carry. Cross's counter-argument was polished and technically competent. He challenged the evidentiary weight of the conference presentation, arguing it was publicly available material with no proven operational link to specific courtroom filings. He cited 3 precedents. Judge Morrow had clearly already read all 3. She asked him 3 questions. He answered 2 completely and 1 obliquely. She made a note, without comment. At 4:45, Judge Morrow stated she would issue a written ruling within 10 business days. She also noted, on the record, that the evidentiary record presented by the plaintiff warranted serious consideration, and that she was formally requesting additional documentation from Hargrove Associates through structured discovery, a step that expanded the case scope beyond the Santos appeal alone. Cross's expression held. His junior associates shifted. In the hallway afterward, Hillary stood without moving for a moment. Camille stood beside her. Peter was a few feet away, organizing papers with the unhurried steadiness that was simply him. "You were ready," Camille said. "We were ready," Hillary said. She looked at Peter. He looked back. Two people who had done the work, standing in the quiet that follows when it has been done. David appeared, said something low to Peter that made him briefly close his eyes toward the ceiling before returning to composure. Camille caught Hillary's look. Hillary looked at the ceiling. The case wasn't over. But for the first time in months, it felt like something that would end, and end in the direction it deserved to. The ruling came in 8 days, 2 ahead of schedule. Hillary read it at her desk at 7:22 a.m. alone, in the early light that came through the office windows at the angle that made the room look like something from before all of this had started. She read it once, then again, then put her phone face down and sat with it. Judge Morrow had granted the Santos appeal on the grounds of procedural irregularity, with evidence of systemic pattern. She had ordered a formal investigation into Hargrove Associates' conduct across the 11 identified cases. She had referred the matter to the Maryland Attorney General's office for potential criminal review of the Whitmore and Reese filings. Maria Santos and her daughters were permitted to return to their apartment, effective immediately, pending resolution. She sat with those sentences for a full minute before she let herself parse what they meant. 6 months ago, she had walked out of a courtroom with a folder pressed to her chest. The case in ruins. The witness gone. The technical ground pulled from under her feet. She had sat on the courthouse steps and breathed. Someone had sat 1 step below. And now this. It did not feel the way she had expected a ruling like this to feel. It felt quieter. Less like triumph, and more like ground that had finally stopped shifting. Which was, she thought, perhaps the more honest version of justice. Not a crescendo, but a stabilization. Camille arrived at 8:05, read the ruling over Hillary's shoulder, and made a sound that wasn't quite a word. 11 families, Hillary said. More than that, Camille said. The AG referral means they look further back. Renata came in at 9, read the ruling, and was quiet for a full moment. The particular quiet of someone who had not been certain this was how it would go. When she looked up, her expression held several things at once. Relief, something that read like pride, and the quiet acknowledgement of someone who had asked for caution and watched the alternative turn out to be right. The funder situation, Hillary said. We'll manage it. Said as fact, not reassurance. The organization's credibility in doing this work is ultimately worth more than the relationship we were protecting. You knew that when you kept going. I hoped it. Renata's expression softened by a precise fraction. That's usually enough. Hillary called her mother from the courthouse steps at noon, standing on the same broad gray stones, in the same late morning light, where this had all begun. Diane answered on the first ring. Hillary told her. Her mother was quiet for a moment. Then, Maria Santos, she gets to go home. She gets to go home. Diane made a sound that was not crying, but was adjacent to it, the controlled version of someone who has learned that feelings are private, but not always suppressible. And you? I'm okay, Hillary said. Then, more carefully, I mean it this time, not the version I usually use. I can hear the difference, Diane said. Peter found her on the steps 20 minutes later. She had been half expecting it. Not because she had called him, but because she had come to understand that some of his appearances were not coincidences and not surveillance. They were a man who paid attention and knew where the moments that mattered tended to happen. He sat beside her, not 1 step below. Same step. He handed her a coffee, the machine kind, from the 3rd floor. She looked at it. You're being very deliberate with this cup, she said. I'm a deliberate person. She drank it. It was as terrible as always. I called my mother. How did she take it? She cried, quietly, and then denied it immediately. Sounds familiar. She looked at him. I don't cry quietly. No, he said, and there was something in the way he said it. Not a correction, not a deflection, just an acknowledgement of what he had actually seen, that made her feel, for the first time in longer than she could precisely locate, entirely visible without it being frightening. "The watch," she said. He looked at her, slightly surprised. "When you told me what you kept, and why, you didn't look at it first. You always do. Before you say something real." "I know." He looked at the steps in front of them. "I didn't need to measure it for that one." She held the coffee cup in both hands. The city moved around them. Traffic, the distant sound of the courthouse door, the accumulated ordinary urgency of a Thursday in Baltimore. The light was wrong for beauty and exactly right for honesty. She thought about 9 years of cases and what they had cost, about the ones she had won and the ones she had lost, and a family that would sleep tonight in the apartment where they belonged, about her mother's notebook, about Peter's watch, about what it meant to keep going when the legitimate reasons to stop were right in front of you. "I used to think doing this work well meant being able to hold all of it myself," she said. "I know. I still think it most days." "I know that too." She looked at him. "But today I'm willing to find out what it looks like when I don't." He turned to look at her, and his expression was the one she had been learning. Not the composed professional, not the measured consultant. Just him. "I think it looks like this," he said. The two of them on the same step. Coffee that had no right to matter as much as it did. A case won because neither of them had done it alone. A woman who had become a lawyer because a man in a suit had not helped her mother, who had spent 9 years being the help she had once needed, and who was learning, late but not too late, that receiving was not the opposite of giving. The courthouse doors opened behind them. The city continued. Some things begin with someone one step below. The ones that last find their way to the same one. Thunbury. You started this for people who had no one. Today it hurt, because you are still that person. The line had arrived on the courthouse steps, like something from a conversation she hadn't known she was still having with herself. From a man who had been present in hallways and reliable in documents for 4 years. Consistent in the specific, unglamorous way that courtrooms teach you to trust. Not someone who made grand declarations. Someone who showed up, stayed, and knew the difference between the two. She had been running close to empty for longer than she had admitted, even in private. The cases were real. The families were real. The injustice was real, and none of her commitment to it was performance. But there is a difference between conviction and the compulsion to carry conviction alone, and she had confused them for most of her adult life, because the confusion had come from somewhere older than the work. Her mother had closed a door on offered help, and spent 3 weeks carrying what she didn't have to carry. Hillary had spent 9 years turning that closed door into a career, without realizing she was also living inside it. The pattern was not obvious from the inside. It rarely is. You think you are being strong and self-sufficient. You think the weight is proof that you can handle it. You don't notice that you have organized your entire professional and personal life around never having to admit that handling it is costing you something. The Santos case became a landmark in Baltimore civil housing litigation, not from a single dramatic verdict, but from what it produced. A formal investigation into systemic procedural sabotage in eviction proceedings. The disbarment of 2 Whitmore and Reese associates who had knowingly filed misleading challenges. A policy change requiring cross-referencing of procedural challenges in cases involving the same management companies. 12 families had their cases reviewed. 9 received remediation. Gerald Cross resigned from active practice before the review concluded. The restructured Hargrove Associates settled 4 civil claims in the following year. Maria Santos moved back into her apartment 2 weeks after the ruling. Her daughters returned to the same school. The crack in the kitchen tile was still there. She had not replaced the small rug. Hillary heard these details from Camille, who had followed up. She wrote a note in the margin of the file in small letters, the way her mother wrote things she needed to keep, and closed the folder. Peter took on a formal consulting role in the housing cases that came out of the investigation. Work he had already been doing, now credited and sustainable, with boundaries that belonged to him rather than being dictated by the shape of someone else's crisis. He told Hillary over machine coffee. She told him it was about time. He said he knew, and that the timing had been his own choice, which was the point. Camille said, directly and without circling it, "You're both insufferably mature about this, and I want it on record that I knew first." David, upon being told, said, "Finally," and returned to his coffee. Renata, when she heard, said nothing for a moment, and then, "I'm glad." She said it in the tone that meant she was speaking for herself, not the organization. It was, Hillary reflected, the most personal thing Renata had ever said to her, and it landed accordingly. Diane Johnson called on a Sunday evening. "I've been thinking," she said, "about the woman from the housing organization, the one I turned away. Mom, I know I can't fix it. I'm not asking to." Her voice was clear, the clarity of someone putting something down deliberately, after a long time of carrying it. "I wanted you to know that refusing help is something you learn, and so is the other thing." Hillary stood at her kitchen window, looking at the row of row houses across the street, the ones that looked permanent from outside, and the ones that weren't, and the difficulty of knowing the difference until you had been there long enough to see both. "I know," she said. "You're learning it," Diane said. "That's what counts." The story ends where it began, the courthouse steps. Hillary and Peter arrive separately on a Tuesday in November, for different cases, when the light is low and gray and precisely honest. The kind of November light in Baltimore that doesn't flatter anything but shows everything clearly. They find each other in the hallway with the ease of people who no longer need to calculate the ease, acquire 2 cups of terrible third-floor coffee, and walk out to the steps for the minutes before the building demands them back. They sit. Same step. The city moves around them with its consistent, indifferent urgency. Buses, voices, the faint sound of the courthouse door opening and releasing behind them. The same steps. The same gray concrete, warmed or cooled depending on the season. The same city that had been there before either of them, and would be there after, carrying its families and its court dates, and its eviction notices, and its notebooks, and its small rugs over kitchen cracks. "Ready?" he asks. She looks at the city she grew up in, and stayed in and fought for, and nearly broke herself against, and is still, every single morning, choosing. Not because she has figured out how to carry it without cost, but because she has learned, finally, that the choosing doesn't have to be done alone. "I am," she says. And for the first time in as long as she can remember, she means it without the undertow of someone still trying to convince herself. Some things begin on a step below, but the ones that last, they find their way to the same one. If this story stayed with you, leave a like and subscribe, so more stories like this one can exist.